Hey everybody, it's Mr. Hefner again, and today we are going to continue with our unit, Origins of the American Tradition. We're moving, closer in time to us now. We started way back in the 1400s, and we're going to be all the way up to the 1600s today. We are going to read just an excerpt from History of Virginia, written by Captain John Smith. Now, you might recognize that name if you were a Disney fan growing up, or even better, if you're still a Disney fan, because whoever stops being a Disney fan. But if you've ever seen the Disney version of Pocahontas, you know Captain John Smith was the soldier who kind of led and protected everyone at the Jamestown colony, and then kind of fell in love with Pocahontas later on. So we're going to read just an excerpt from his History of Virginia. And it's pretty interesting because you're actually reading a first-person account in the exact words of that person who was really there. And it's kind of fascinating to think that 400 years ago, John Smith had these adventures and these thoughts in his head. And as you read, John Smith is literally talking to you. Stephen King describes writing sometimes as being a form of telepathy, but instead of sending messages from my brain to your brain across the room, we send them hundreds of years down the timeline. And that's pretty fascinating to me. Now, John Smith can't always be trusted. He's a guy who, he was an adventurer. Adventurers like to tell stories, and people who like to tell stories about themselves tend to exaggerate them from time to time. So we'll take a look and we'll see, exactly what's going on. Now, to be fair, I don't want to be unfair with Captain John Smith. There are some historians that say he's not really exaggerating. He's not trying to mislead us, but he was in a situation where he didn't really speak the language of the native peoples and they didn't really speak his. And maybe there was just some misinterpretation of what was really going on here. But I'm going to do a quick introduction to the piece for you. And then if we're doing this in class, we'll read it together. If not, you'll be able to find it in Schoology and you can read it there. So let's get started. All right, here we are. So this is going to be an excerpt. Remember that word "from" up here is always your clue that we're just reading a part of the whole piece, The General History of Virginia by John Smith. And our lesson essential question for this piece is, how does John Smith use point of view? We talked about point of view when we read Bartolomé de las Casas, and chronological order in his account of the founding of Jamestown. So this is another first-person point of view, but you're going to find it very interesting because even though it's first person, he tells it in the third person. So when he talks about all the great things that Captain John Smith does, he doesn't say, then I did these great things. He says, then Captain Smith did these things. It was partly the idea in those days of being modest. Until Benjamin Franklin really wrote his autobiography 100 years later, 100 plus years later, writing about yourself was considered sort of rude. And so John Smith is following the appropriate social guidelines by writing it in the third person, even though it's a first person narration. The other thing we've got going on here is chrono means time. And this is going to be a narrative. And as I've said before, all narratives are chronological. So this story starts at one point and it moves forward in time and just keeps going till it gets to the end. That's a typical story. But even when stories maybe start near the end, go back to the beginning, pass through where they started and end up beyond where they started, even when they jump around with flashbacks, it's still chronological. Time is still the primary way that the story is being structured. All right, John Smith did actually lead an incredibly adventurous life. He's born in 1580 in England, and he could have just grown up to be a farmer and a shopkeeper because he did those things early. But in his early travels, he was captured by the Turks. He was sent to a prison. He escaped from the prison, managed to make it all the way to Russia. And then from Russia, he was able to get back to England. He sailed for the New World on a mission under the authority of King James. And when he founded the first permanent English settlement, remember, we talked about Roanoke, but that wasn't permanent. The first permanent English settlement at Jamestown on the peninsula in Virginia, he named it for the king. In the part that we're going to read today, he gets captured by Powhatan. Now, the people of Powhatan is, John Smith is going to call him the emperor of the American Indians that are there, because he didn't have a different term. Today we use the word chief, but Powhatan is going to be the chief. He's also the adopted daughter of Pocahontas. Later on, John Smith is going to be the governor of Jamestown. That's an elected position, and because he saves the people, he gets that. He returns to England. Jamestown goes on without him. He comes back to the New World later on in 1614 when he maps most of the coast of New England, which was quite an accomplishment because from what I understand, his maps were extremely accurate and very detailed. And you've got to keep in mind, Maine, just the state of Maine alone, has more shoreline than all of California. I know it looks like, how can tiny Maine have more shoreline? But Maine has all these peninsulas and bays and islands offshore. And Captain John Smith mapped many of those, and it's very accurate. Later on, he was captured by pirates and he escaped again. And eventually by 1624, he wrote the entire piece, which we're going to just read an excerpt of that today. So I've told you most of this. It's about the founding of the colony at Jamestown. It goes up to 1609, and that's when Smith went back to England at that point to take on other adventures and things like that. And it describes the way he was saved from death by Pocahontas. Now, we'll talk a little bit about whether or not he might have just been misinterpreting what was going on. Perhaps they weren't going to kill him. It might have been part of a plan, but we'll take a look at that later. We're not going to click on Pocahontas because I can't play a video in a video, but if you're with me in class, we will take a look at some historians' interpretations of this. All right, so we've talked about this term already, chronological order. Chrono means time, and so chronological order is using time to present information, and that's the way we do narratives, and this is a narrative. And then we've got point of view, and point of view gets a little sticky here because it's the vantage point from which a story is told. And if a story is told in I did this, I did that, that's first person. But if it's told he, she, they did something, that then becomes third person. So what we've got in this story is we've got an adventure that was experienced first person. The first person is telling the story, but he chooses to narrate it in the style of a third person story. All right, well, you'll see what I'm talking about when we get there. So when you read the selection, I want you to look for evidence of the point of view and how he handles that, and how even when he's telling third person, his first person point of view still shines through there. Pay attention to the chronology of this as well, the order that the events come in, and then his style. It's not an easy piece to read. You have to understand, he's writing at a time when Shakespeare was around. And people often say Shakespeare is difficult. It's modern English. It's not old English. It is modern English. But the phrasing is different than the way we would phrase things today. And then over here, I have a map. Some of you have probably been down on the Chesapeake Bay. If you've ever crossed the Chesapeake Bay Bridge Tunnel, that is down here. We've got the very large naval base of Norfolk is down here. And it was on this peninsula where the Jamestown colony grew. So that's the area that this whole thing is taking place today. There's a picture of Pocahontas, a very famous one. You can go to the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., and you can see this one hanging on the wall. And I know it seems a little bit odd, like why is Pocahontas dressed like she's dating Shakespeare? And we think this was painted around 1616, and that would have been the year that Shakespeare died. And it's because she went back to England. She went with John Smith. She went back to England. She met the royalty. And unfortunately, she died of European diseases because she didn't have the kind of ability to deal with viruses and things like that her body was not used to. All right, so you're going to read the story, and then you're going to come back here to these questions. So I would pause the video at this point so you can come back later. For the sake of the video, I'm going to go on right now, though, and we'll pretend we just finished reading the story. During the first horrible winter in Virginia, Smith and the colonists were surprised when the natives brought them food. According to Smith, what caused the natives to suddenly be so generous? The natives wanted to trade food for guns. God changed their hearts. the natives were too ill-advised and didn't know that the colonists were going to be unfriendly, or the chief of the native tribe wanted to forge a treaty with Smith. I'll give you a hint. When you're reading literature from this time period, God plays a big part in everything that happened. People believed in something called providence, that God was looking out for them. And even when bad things happened, it was just a challenge from God. So in this case, when the natives suddenly become charitable and bring food at the point when the English need it most, it's because God changed them from being angry to being helpful. All right. The emperor of the Native Americans, this would be Powhatan. So let's just say Powhatan. Powhatan stopped John Smith from being clubbed to death so that Smith could do what? Show them the way to the colonist camp, work making hatchets and trinkets for the natives, share his stories of sailing across the ocean, or forge a treaty between the natives and the Europeans. And oddly enough, it's work making hatchets and trinkets for the natives. In Native American culture at that time, even if you were the chief of everyone, you still made your own materials. You still did work for yourself. You didn't have slaves or servants or anything like that. And so he wanted Smith to use his skills to make things that only the English could make at that point. How about this one? Some of the other colonists held Smith responsible for attacks by native people, the shortage of food and drink, the deaths of Robinson and Emery, or the sinking of their ship. And it was the deaths of Robinson and Emery. So once again, we get the story the way John Smith told it. So Smith was with these fellows. These guys get killed. Smith goes through an incredible adventure, and he's the only one who comes back. And he was responsible for the expedition. So you can see what it looks like to people who weren't there. Several people go on an expedition, everybody dies, one comes back unharmed, and he tells the story. Do you trust him or not? And so some of them actually wanted to have Smith charged for crimes against violating the Bible because of their deaths. What did Powhatan offer Smith in exchange for 2 guns? And when we say guns here, we mean cannons. They were demi-culverins was the term they used. It would be a relatively small cannon. What did Powhatan offer Smith in exchange for 2 guns and a grindstone? Was it land, animal skins, food, or his daughter? It was his daughter. Powhatan adopted at some point Pocahontas to be his daughter, and now he offers his daughter to John Smith in exchange for these items. Part of the reason might have been that she could work as a translator and go back and forth between the 2 cultures. Who does Smith ultimately credit for the survival of the people at the Jamestown colony? Powhatan for providing them help, himself for his great deeds of heroism, Pocahontas because she could persuade her father Powhatan, or God. And as we just said a moment ago, in the 1600s, God gets credit for everything. So that would be God as well. Okay. All right. So that's our introduction to the history of Virginia by Captain John Smith. If you haven't already read the piece in class, make sure you read the piece. It's a great read. It's difficult, it's challenging at times because of the way the words are phrased, but it's a true adventure. And there's that little problem in there of trying to figure out, can I trust this guy? This sounds pretty miraculous for him to be able to pull this off. So read it with just a little bit of doubt as you go along. All right, thank you if you stayed with me to the end, and I'll see you next time.